Okay, this is going to be a talk about logical fallacies. It's an important thing to keep in mind when we're making arguments that there is an ethical aspect when we're trying to convince people of our point of view. And basically, when people use logical fallacies to try to prove a point, they're either being lazy or they're being intentionally unethical and they're trying to trick people. Another reason why I think it's important to take some time to look at these is that you're going to hear these in the media and from politicians of all stripes every day. So, part of this class is information literacy and learning to be critical consumers of information. In the age of fake news and alternative facts, I think this is more important than ever. Another potential use for knowing the logical fallacies is if you find a source using one to make an argument, you could use that for counter argument. The fact that they're using a logical fallacy calls into question their argument. Another thing you're going to see throughout this, when I made an earlier version of this PowerPoint, I took a break and scrolled through Facebook for a while. And a friend of mine who teaches English in Japan had posted a gallery of NFL referees calling logical fallacies as though they are fouls. And so I think that those are amusing. Okay, the first one is non sequitur, and as this referee is saying, attempting to link two points that have nothing to do with each other. Non sequitur is Latin for does not follow. So, in the 1980s, President Reagan had an idea that he called trickle down economics. Um, and the premise of this is that you support and give money to the richest people in society, and that wealth will trickle down to all the poor people. That does not follow, and in fact, that did not happen. Even George H.W. Bush, when he was running against Reagan in the primaries in 1980, called this voodoo economics. So, a lot of the logical fallacies try to establish relationships between two different things that just don't hold up. And that's what makes them kind of tricky because comparisons, metaphors, is how we learn. We learn new things by seeing how they're like what we already know and how they're not like what we already know. But again, we need to be vigilant as critical consumers of information. Ad hominem attack. Personal foul. Attack the opponent instead of his argument. So ad hominem is Latin for to the man. So it's attacking someone's character, not their ideas. So during the midterm election with President Obama, a lot of people were questioning, can we trust a Mormon to be president? A lot of people misunderstood the church, and I think that really hurt Mitt Romney's chances. And it wasn't fair. His faith had nothing to do with his qualifications to be president. They did the same thing with JFK and him being a Catholic. This meme, kind of the joke is Romney was saying he wanted to defund PBS, so saying he's going after Big Bird. Again, you'll see this all the time in the media and in politics. Even in the last election, some people said you can't trust Secretary Clinton because her husband cheated on her. And so that was like ad hominem by association. Again, totally beside the point of the facts of the case. Appeal to tradition is one where people justify doing something because we've always done it this way. This is our traditions, but that's not a sufficient reason to keep doing things. There are part of our traditions in the history of America that certainly needed to end, like, say, slavery. One place where people use the appeal to tradition is with American Indian mascots. I thought that this news graphic made an interesting and thought provoking equivalency. The owner of the Washington football team says it's our tradition. But the dictionary definition of the word redskin is racist term. So just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we should keep doing this way. Things sometimes need to change. Bandwagon argument. Agreeing with a bunch of people who are wrong makes you just as wrong, which I think is a funny way of putting it. But this one's pretty tricky too because it kind of sounds like democracy. We believe in majority rule, right? In electoral politics, yes. With dealing with facts and arguments, no. So, um, a few years ago, there was a mass shooting at an African American church in South Carolina, about a block from the Capitol, where they flew the rebel flag. A majority of South Carolinians thought it should stay, but they ended up taking it down. So just because most people think it's right doesn't necessarily mean it's right. In the days after September 11th, polling showed 70 to 80% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein had direct involvement in it. And whatever else you want to say about him, no, that wasn't right. Um, I think for this meme, I typed in white trash. Um, Also, years ago, there was a guy who was selling the 100 health secrets they don't want you to know. So it already sounds like a conspiracy theory. And some of it made sense, like 8 8-ounce glasses of water a day. But then he also said things like, if you touch anything that's been in a microwave, you'll get cancer. And so he was on CNN, and they're like, well, what's your evidence for this? And he's like, well, 3 million people bought my book. Just because you tricked a lot of people doesn't mean that you're right. Circular logic. Argument has no supporting evidence. This is also sometimes called begging the question. Now, in the media, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, that begs the question, that, meaning it raises a legitimate further question. But in rhetorical terms, begging the question is using the assumption that you're right as the proof that you're right. So, he can't be a criminal because he's a popular athlete. That begs the question of whether or not he committed a crime, right? And with a lot of things, there seems to be a double standard for accountability with athletes and celebrities, right? But that, again, that's assuming he's innocent as the proof that he's innocent. False analogy. So this is another one that sets up a false relationship between two different things. And analogy is a powerful way to develop ideas and argue. But if the relationship isn't sufficient, then it's not valid. Some people call this the apples and oranges fallacy. You can't compare apples to oranges, as the old cliche goes. So, during, at least since 9/11, through W. Bush's administration and Obama's administration, people said that if you criticize the president or his foreign policy, the terrorists win. Well, those two things aren't the same. We can be against terrorism, but still critical of certain foreign policy decisions that both presidents made, that in hindsight seem to have been mistaken. False authority. So this is citing someone as an authority when they don't have the relevant credentials or experience to be an authority. So a lot of people say there is no evidence humans have caused climate change, but they don't cite scientists as that. They cite politicians, media personalities, things like that. They are not authorities on science. Celebrity endorsements are kind of a false authority thing, unless they really are experts on the products that they're endorsing. A few years ago, there used to be a commercial for this revolutionary new addiction cure developed by a university professor, and they made sure they said that a lot of times. But in the small print, it said that he's a professor of mathematics. And so if he wants to remind me how to calculate the surface area of my kitchen to replace the floor, sure. I want someone with actual expertise to help get me off drugs. I found had an example of this in my one of my classes last semester, where someone had found a report on issues with African Americans and the police. And it was by a professor at the University of Santa Barbara. And I'm like, well, that sounds good. But then he was a professor of humanities. So I don't think he has the right expertise to talk about that. False causality. Coincidence illegally substituted for proof. This is also sometimes called the correlation is not causation fallacy. Just because one thing happens after the first thing doesn't mean the first thing caused it. But again, cause and effect is a great way to develop ideas, so this one can be tricky. Okay, any president, and this has happened throughout history, being either blamed or praised for something that happens in their first few months in office is a false cause. They haven't been there long enough to affect any change, good or bad. Um, and so, as long as I can remember, new presidents have been blamed for things that were caused by the previous president. Some new presidents are praised for things that were set in motion by their predecessor. And cause and effect doesn't work that way. False dilemma. This is sometimes called the either or fallacy, that you have to choose between these two things. And any issue that's important and complicated is going to have more than two options. So we can either have personal freedom or we can fight the terrorists. Why can't we protect our liberties and fight terrorism? This meme came out right after the revelations of the mass data collection by the National Security Agency, so Obama asking for the share everything plan makes me chuckle. But yeah, you're oversimplifying, which is another fallacy we'll get to, if you think there's only two ways to go. Guilt by association. So this one's tricky too because it's part of our criminal justice system. You can be arrested for associating with criminals or felons. But in logical terms, it's not enough to discredit someone. This is a picture of me. I think I was like 18, half my head's shaved, the other half is kind of bluish. When the big box stores like Best Buy first came out, I took a friend of mine to get a stereo, and he overheard one of the workers say, "Follow that guy, punk rockers always steal." Now, he didn't tell me that because he didn't want me to make a scene. He wanted to buy a stereo. But that's an example of guilt by association. Any kind of profiling, and obviously racial profiling is a much more serious instance than what I experienced. Stereotyping, scapegoating, this is all guilt by association. All people are like this for a group of people. Or even, for years there have been jokes about how you can't trust any lawyer, right? Again, that's kind of a guilt by association thing, and it's not entirely fair. Hasty generalization, not enough numbers on the field to represent the whole. So you could also call this jumping to conclusions, drawing a conclusion based on insufficient evidence to prove that conclusion. So social media makes most kids not able to interact face to face. I think that's a hasty generalization because we're not done with how social media is affecting the youth. It's an ever evolving thing. There's new platforms all the time. So to claim a total effect, I think, is premature. Oversimplification. So a lot of these fallacies are some form or another of trying to make things out to be more simple than they are. And all of your topics are not simple. They're important and complex. So this is kind of a catch-all for ones that don't fall under some of the other ways of oversimplifying, like false dilemma. Video games cause violence is an oversimplification. Video games have nothing to do with violence, I think would also be an oversimplification. Because video games might be one piece in a larger puzzle of things going wrong in an individual's life that would lead them to be a mass shooter, right? So they're not a sufficient cause, but it's not like they have nothing to do with it. I had a student a few years back who was getting ready to retire from the Salt Lake Police Department, and he was interested in violence in video games based on what his kids were playing, and so he researched it, and he found a study that showed that playing first-person shooter games didn't make someone more likely to be a mass shooter, but it made their accuracy much higher if they played mass shooting games. So both sides. It has nothing to do with it. or it has everything to do with it, are oversimplifications. Red herring on the field. What the hell does this have to do with anything? I think that's a good definition. So, a red herring is bringing up something that has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but is sensationalist or frightening, and that's why it's effective. So, immigrants steal our jobs. Immigrants are lazy and take advantage of welfare. I can't believe that the same people hold both of these stereotypes since they're contradictory, right? But our jobs or taking advantage of welfare are red herrings because those make people think that they're losing something when immigrants' impact on the economy and industries like farm workers is way more complicated than that and not that easy. But again, this would also be a kind of a guilt by association thing. But people bring up red herrings to distract from the issue. Slippery slope. This is another one that you'll hear sometimes in the media where they say, well, that this is a slippery slope to that. And what they mean is that the second thing, you have good reason for thinking it could happen. In rhetorical terms, a slippery slope is making wild predictions about the future that have no basis in reality. So, before marriage equality was the law of the land, a lot of people would say if we allow gay marriage, then we have to let people marry their goats. A crazy prediction about the future. No, actually, we don't. Under the law, a marriage license is a legal contract, and goats can't sign those. Or we'll have to let people marry their siblings. Nope, that's still illegal too. So it's making these kind of, it's fear mongering. It's making these crazy predictions of, oh, if we don't do this, then it's going to be a nightmare future. And it's effective because it scares people, but it ignores the evidence of a reasonable causal link. So, look out for these in your sources. Make sure you don't use these in your papers, but also just in your everyday life. Be more critical consumers of information. Don't let people be lazy or try to trick you or misinform you.